I was really struck with the way that the two presentations were, in a way, flip sides of each other. And what I was thinking about as you were both presenting was something that comes up in my dialogue work all the time, which is in setting ground rules for dialogue, we frequently say that the ground rules are to provide a safe container for talking about controversial things. And there's always, or frequently, someone in my group, and it's always a person of color, who says, nothing's safe about this discussion. And it's presumptuous of you to frame it that way, because it may be safe for you, white girl, but it's not safe for me, and it never is. And I just was struck in these two presentations of especially Jack talking about the ghost behind the dominant narrative that's constantly there, but not that white folks aren't tuned to hearing, and there's nothing safe about it. And as we talk about immigrants' contribution to America, or America's easy assimilation of immigrants, there's another narrative there always that where there's nothing safe and there's nothing easy about any of that. And so that's just, I was struck with that.
Susie?
Yeah. I agree with Susie. I think we got two sides of the coin, and both are important for dialogue within museums, within public spaces. One is the celebratory part, and that's the part that David, that I think you did very, very well. Immigration is one of the things that Americans can celebrate. Even though we argue about it, even though we are constantly hammering away at each other, in essence, what's made America what it is immigration, right? Handlin said it back in 1951. I set out to write a history of immigration in America and discovered that the history of immigration is the history of America. And I thought you brought that out very, very well in a broad panorama. On the other hand, there is the flip side of this that Jack brought up, and that is has been to every immigration in American history resistance of some kind, based on religion, based on race, based on a variety of things. And we're certainly seeing that right now. The question is how to create that safe space that you're talking about. What needs to be established, and what is so hard to establish, I think, is trust. You can't have a dialogue about these things without trust. And so I think one of the challenges that all of the museum folks face is establishing within your walls an atmosphere in which folks feel comfortable talking about these things, or a set of programs that break down the resistance to that kind of discussion and dialogue over the images of the kind that you showed, Jack. How do you begin a discussion, especially with young people, about these very, very horrific, but very, very real images? How do you do this in a way that's constructive rather than a way that reinforces the polarities and the disagreements and the hatreds? And I think one of the ways might be to talk about the issue of visceralness. We all have visceral feelings, and being willing to share what some of those visceral feelings and stereotypes are is one of the first steps in coping with them and dealing with them and getting them out on the table. And the museum can be the place where this dialogue begins. This can be a place where the safe space is established. And so the challenge then becomes to establish programs, whether they're lectures, panels, films, but also just a place where people can talk to one another about these feelings and about these issues, where they don't come to blows, because there's already been an ethic of civility and a safe space established. So I think this is one of the areas where the museum can serve a very positive function in dealing with contemporary issues informed by the historical narrative.
Okay, 3 quick points. One of which I'll just put out there and then walk away from, which is that in fact the United States is not the only nation of immigrants, and there are lots of countries around the world that have been formed through migration but don't celebrate themselves in quite this way. That's an interesting observation for maybe you to think about, but that's not what I'm going to talk more about now. What I really want to talk about is whether or not immigration is the best way to frame a discussion about insiders and outsiders, which is sort of Jack's way of thinking about it, or the best way to tackle the inclusivity and the capacity to include, incorporate, and transform. That is the frame of David's talk. It's possible that by stepping outside or beyond the framework of immigration, we can actually have a more productive discussion about it. That's sort of the gist of this little piece that I circulated among y'all, and that's also what I'll talk a little bit more about this afternoon. I did, however, want to say one thing about viscerality, since I also spend a fair amount of time thinking about it. You know, in some ways, the people who we imagine participating in dialogues are perhaps ahead on the viscerality front, because the blending and the mixing that Jack refers to in his discussion of food often is well in advance of sort of theoretical and abstract coming to terms with diversity. It happened without, in many cases, a celebration of multiculturalism, that the US diet became a multicultural one. The other viscerality point, and here too, the folks we imagine in dialogue may be ahead of us, is the sexual one. David mentioned that Barack Obama is probably our first multiracial president. Well, maybe. We've had a lot of Southern presidents, and my guess is that some of them, unbeknownst to themselves, were parts of multiracial families. People have sex with each other, they fall in love with each other, they intermarry in the past and now in huge rates, and the willingness of people to cross racial and othering boundaries of all sorts in order to cuddle up and have sex, whatever that means to them, in some cases to reproduce, is often well in advance of society's ideas about blending and mixing. So one viscerality on the eating side and one viscerality on the sex side. We're just trying to keep up.
Great.
These two presentations really bring to mind a classic discussion that we have with visitors at Ellis Island over and over. Happens all the time, every day. There's a disconnect between people who come to Ellis celebrating the history of their immigrant ancestors versus dealing with immigration today. And many people will come up to me after a tour, say, and say, isn't it wonderful what my grandparents went through? But those immigrants today. And I'm wondering if you have any advice about how to deal with this disconnect. A few visitors, you can make them think by taking them through a tour, but there's a certain segment that you just have to let them vent and back off and say, okay, I'm not going to change their minds about immigration today. Any advice on how to deal with this situation?
Yes. Not to you, Jack. I think we can do two things. The first thing is to show the continuity of immigration in American history, that this goes back well before the formal formation of our union. And one of the things I try to emphasize early on is that Benjamin Franklin walks about the streets of Philadelphia and he's grousing about all these Germans. And he's saying, you know, in another 10, 20 years, if this immigration keeps up the way it is, we're all going to be speaking German. We're all going to be eating sauerkraut. And this, to some degree, reflects some of the arguments today. So some of the anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, anti-Jewish, anti-Muslim cartoons that both of us showed are certainly there today. And that was the purpose of when I brought in this Immigration cartoon, to show that this was a continuity. At the same time, it's important to make the point that, yeah, these first and maybe second generation of immigrants were very different. And that difference in particular really grated upon native-born Americans. But after a while, they became part of America. How did they become part of America? They became part of America because they entered the workforce, because they got an education, because their foodways were adopted to some degree, because their cultures were celebrated. The expectation in this country is not that immigrants give up their culture, but that immigrants merge their cultures with the general society, and that changes both. So if we look upon this as a dynamic process, I think we can engage people to see that what has come before is actually what is happening now. Many people, or some people in my community of Charlotte say, well, you know, when are these guys going to start speaking English and stop speaking Spanish? Well, the fact is that these immigrants are actually learning English much faster than my ancestors learned English. I mean, I can remember my grandmother speaking Russian until the day she died. So this is not particularly unusual. And in fact, I had a student do a study in South Carolina. South Carolina offers a general testing in the 8th grade on reading and math. And in 2011, for the first time, Hispanic students actually surpassed African American students in the English portion of the exam. And many of these Hispanic students, their parents only spoke Spanish at home, so they didn't get that constant reinforcement. But their scores are going up, and that follows the pattern of immigrants throughout American history. And just one last point here about African Americans. The points that Alan and Donna and Susie made are absolutely correct. The danger it's important to try to integrate the African American experience into our broader immigrant experience. There's no question about that, and there are ways we can do that. But at the same time, we cannot conflate the two, because it tends to flatten out how really different the African American experience was in this country.
I'm here to kind of connect and discover that experience with my grandparents, the good immigrants, and it's totally dissociating themselves from the bad immigrants of today. Now, that's an interesting kind of dilemma. I teach a course, I was telling some people, called Dangerous and Intermingled, and it's really about the kind of mapping of the political psychology and political culture of New York City. And if we're to actually walk through the city and how differences were actually played out spatially, we could go to the 1741. Jill Lepore wrote this amazing book I really recommend you looking at, you know, of how, okay, I guess we have to speak closer, how race was spatialized, but it was really linked to gender, right? And it was linked to ideas of purity and dirtiness, right? So I really feel that unless we can kind of get at some of that stuff, you know, of that dissociation, when we read Henry James, Washington Square, you see it played out, right? Downtown, the Docklands are the dirty place, but also the freer space. The intermingled space is a freer space, but it's not the proper space, right? So as new groups come in, by definition, in some ways, by assimilating and acculturating and passing within that dominant white Anglo-American Protestant culture that has set up in some ways these hierarchies of cleanliness and dirtiness and purity, then people are in some ways adapting those same values. So when you have the immigrants walking in at the Tennant Museum, the children and grandchildren of immigrants repeating in many ways what had been said about their grandparents, right? Had been said about them, not by them, right? So there's that disassociation from that experience as the grandparents actually may have experienced it in the context of the time, and identifying really with the dominant Anglo-American Protestant culture and judgments that were made, right? So these are all fragments that we're all living in, and these are fragments that are juxtaposing the present and the past. So I think it's really a fallacy somehow to think that we can look at that past purely in some way and recover it. We're always, including historians, including the most rigorous historians, always in juxtaposition, playing with how the present looks from whatever the vantage we're dealing with at the present moment, right? So Barbara and I were talking earlier, and she was telling me about the intersectional nature of this work. I think that's really the paradigm in many ways that we now need to be kind of operating within, in which there are multiple axes of identification and power, right? And they operate in different ways in different situations, at different moments, in different places, right? And they're chronotopic. Bakhtin developed this idea for the novel of time-place knots, in which the novel represents a meaning that's created from the novelist's present to some other moment in the future or in the past, right? So what is that knot of the time and of the present, past, and future of different places that we really need to recognize? Every historical statement we make, every historical interpretation we have, everything that a visitor says to us is actually a chronotope. It's a meaning that's created. And some meanings have more historical documentation, more archival evidence. Others have more visceral evidence to support what it really means, right? And can you use the rational white male kind of tradition to confront what is held to be by a working class black person as a deeper truth, right? So how can we get at that kind of reckoning with what's a safe space? What is a safe space? How can we make that? Can we actually create a safe space in a museum? Can we do that, right? Can we really do that? Or do we need to kind of build and borrow on people who we've developed relationships of deeper trust with in communities, right? So these are the questions that you all and we all have to really kind of reckon with, yeah.
The question I have is how can we be constructively disruptive? So I have to say that my visceral reaction to your presentations was to be upset by the cartoons in a way that I feel like in some ways someone coming into a museum would see a stereotype and that it would reinscribe the pain of the moment. And so one of the questions is, in those we don't see, who does the system of immigration serve? This idea of, this, as Jack, you said, sort of the white male Christian, Protestant perspective, and sort of that how we really think about power and how we can, as public historians, question ourselves about, well, what sources do we use and whose philosophy and what knowledge and how do we construct even this idea of, well, what are the ways we understand this? It's thinking about this in a way that tries to center on a different experience as a way to disrupt the assumptions and the ideas that we make. And I think there's a lot to learn from historians about this, women's historians who choose to put women in the center of the story, not just as actors, but from the point of view, and how does that change the way we understand the place? The same way labor historian, but this, that sort of movement of decentering a white male perspective. And that there are ways, I think, for us to think about that, and we have to be very creative, that disrupts a visitor's experience. So even a friend of mine curated an exhibit at the Levine Museum about changing places. I think some of you may be familiar with it. And one of the things she and I talked about was this idea of personal space. and how a piece of that exhibit was about disrupting your idea that there is one idea about how close a person should be or how far away. And that the way that the exhibit designer worked it out was in a visceral experience. You know, you stood in relation and it was like, oh wow, this doesn't feel right. So, I mean, I guess that this idea of like not showing the truth of those relationships that are in the cartoons, the lynching, the violence, the riots, you know, the raping of women, you know, the violence that kind of keeps those systems strong and, you know, helps us to understand, you know, why those things happen. That's not what we see. You know, that's not the reality that we're thinking about putting into our exhibits, right? And I think that that's hard. I mean, we think about the experience in the South of the exhibit of the traveling postcards of lynchings. And how do you present that kind of work? And that the part that, of course, is so, you know, the violence of the actual lynching is very upsetting, but so is the joy of the observers, right? So, you know, I just wonder if there are ways that we can be constructively disruptive, because, you know, right, we want people to come to our places, we want to expand their ideas about things, but the real history of this is incredibly brutal, is incredibly violent, is the otherness is not just a construct, like you say, the visceral experience of that is much, much harder for us to truly talk about and interpret, and yet I think it's the piece of this story that really helps us understand the underlying power politics of who did immigration, you know, policy really serve. You know, white corporate America. So, you know, I mean, I know that's not an easy question, but how do we recenter or decenter or you know, think about where we put the point of view in a different place?
I mean, yeah, there's so much I think that you're saying. I mean, one of my responses is that there's an idea that's developing, Joe Dolan among others, about this idea of critical generosity, and it's the same kind of juxtaposition that you're suggesting, which is how can we acknowledge and fully recognize what people are saying on whatever level it is and accept it, but at the same time be able to take it in a spirit and return it in a spirit that it's offered. So it's a practice that's actually very hard among academics because, you know, we're used to kind of just trying to rip each other apart. Not this company. I mean, this is the unusual, I think, alternative, you know, kind of group. But the practice, you know, in most academics, I mean, the more prestigious you are, the more you're supposed to do it, is to rip somebody apart, you know? And, you know, we can't do that. We can't bring that kind of spirit into a community setting. It's not the way to build trust, you know? But at the same time, we want to be able to truly talk and open up and compare, right? And are we as academics, or as we as museum people, curators, whatever position you all, you know, come from, are we capable of doing that ourselves with the people that we want to supposedly do that with, right? And that becomes a very basic question of relationship building and trust building, I think, in part. So I think this idea of critical generosity, which is really tied to your framing of this kind of constructively disruptive, I think these are the ways in which I think when people sense that we're talking honestly and in a heartfelt way.
Just let me say briefly, I think context is key here. I think you need to offend people. I tell my students the first day of class that I hope I offend you, because out of offense they'll start to think, and by challenging them they may even change their ideas. But the context, it really is important. I ask my students to, one of their assignments is to report on the Without Sanctuary exhibit that's online.
Photograph.
So lynching photographs, and it's pretty brutal. But I think if you hit people over the head all the time, you're going to turn them off. What you need to do is frame it in the broader context of the journey, and I've used this in the past, that our country's on a journey to fulfill those wonderful ideals in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And there have been many detours along this journey to fulfill those ideals, and we're not at the destination yet. But we're much farther along today in 2013 than we were in 1776. So I think if you frame it in a more positive context, you can instruct on the brutality of the cartoons that Jack and I showed.